Before I get into the main subject of this video, I do want to say a few words about the violence yesterday in London, and that's what it was. It was going to say protests there, but really, let's be honest, it was just a riot, just violence. Um, Today is actually this is not connected, but it's just on my mind. Today is actually the third anniversary of the Grenfell fire disaster, the 14th of June. 3 years today. Um, and it was the early hours of the morning that the fire broke out. So it's very much on my mind. I'm sure it'll be on the mind of the hundreds of people who were involved in that tragedy. So I'm definitely sparing a thought for them today. I imagine it's the sort of thing where even as time goes on, it'll never really the horror of that night will never really heal. It was one of London's worst disasters. Very interested in the history of London, and I intend to do more research. There's actually a site called London Disasters, which I strongly recommend if you're interested in history. London Disasters Map, it's actually called, and it covers a lot of disasters that aren't well known, such as the Great Fire of 1212. Um, it covers lots of other disasters that are less documented. But anyway, a few words about the protests yesterday, then I'll get into the main point. I want to put in this video rather than uploading a new video. Um, Boris Johnson and his choice of words were interesting. He said that it's a group of racist thugs, or we have no time for racist thuggery. Now that use of the term racist was obviously deliberate. The Prime Minister wouldn't have said that flippantly, so he obviously felt that there was a racist element there. Um, I think there unquestionably was. I think the likes of the ADL and Britain First, whatever they claim they are, far right groups, sure, they may have ostensibly been set up to combat pan-Islamism, but you know when people get tanked up, I think they start to show their true colours. And some of the arrests, yes, I don't know how many total arrests there were, but certainly some of them were for drunken disorder. When people get drunk, they tend to lose their inhibitions. And basically, what I saw yesterday to me resembled a bunch of football hooligans. There's no other way to put it. If you are throwing things at the police, missiles, projectiles, there was some sort of explosive. I don't know precisely what that was, some sort of flare. Um, and you're shouting, ADL, like I said in the last video. I'm reiterating this point because it's important. Do not tell me that you're just a patriot, okay? You are a hooligan, basically. You may not even be racist, right? But you're behaving like that. You're not doing any PR favors for yourself. And then the same people whine that they get a bad reputation. So I've no sympathy with them. I really don't. There was one incident where one of these white counter demonstrators was apparently set on. I didn't see that, which is awful if it happened. And a Black Lives Matter protester was carrying him away. I imagine it's going to be one of the takeaway images. Fair play to the Black Lives Matter guy for stepping in, but then again, it was Black Lives Matter people that attacked him in the first place. So I think there are violent elements on both sides. I really do. Sadiq Khan's response, I think, has been quite weak because it's not being consistent. A strong mayor, now more than ever, needs to be consistent. And what was Sadiq Khan's response? With the disorder coming from the Black Lives Matter protest, his attitude was basically, oh, it's disappointing. It was mostly peaceful protests, but the small minority who were violent, you have let down the movement. It was more like tones of disappointment, like you've let us down. Now, when it came to yesterday's violence, it was a lot more hardline. It was, I mean, the mayor's rhetoric was racist, thuggery and intolerance has no place in our society, and they will face the full consequences of the law. Quite a different pitch. Yet the trouble was pretty similar, similar sorts of incidents. In both cases, you had um, idiots throwing things at the police and generally making an ass out of themselves. So why is the mayor's tone different in both cases. That's a problem, I think. It's interesting that neither Keir Starmer of Labour or Priti Patel used the word racism in their condemnation. They both condemned the violence yesterday, but they didn't use the term racism. Now, that might be politically quite savvy because I've no doubt there were racist elements there. In fact, there was supposed to be racist taunts coming from some of these louts. It wouldn't at all surprise me if there was. Um, but it is interesting that Patel and Starmer chose not to use that term, but the Prime Minister did. That's interesting. Um, yeah. So I mentioned the main part of this video, but maybe it's I won't speak at it in massive length. All of what we are seeing here comes down to the whole identity politics clash, and I believe right now it's toxic. An acquaintance of mine earlier wrote that what is happening, he'd responded to a post I made, what is happening is setting back race relations in this country 50 years. And I think I know I knew what he meant with that. Because what we're seeing is problems arising that don't need to arise. Now, this is not to say that everything is perfect and we were all living in harmony beforehand and everything was, there weren't issues. I do think that the coronavirus lockdown has probably exacerbated some of these tensions, and as it said in the report yesterday, maybe some of that was letting off steam. I think there might be some psychology in that. There will be genuine racial tensions pre-existing, but I honestly think what we don't need is some of the mantra coming over from the United States, nonsense about white privilege and so on. That's actually an American concept, and it was thought up by an American white academic. I don't recall her name now, but what we are seeing, some of the American identity politics starting to drift over here. That's not to say Britain has a perfect record, so that group, Britain is not innocent. I get it. Britain is not innocent. Britain doesn't have a perfect record. But what we're seeing now is I really do think it's something like a cultural revolution because we are seeing this attempt to purify society. And what's really unfortunate about yesterday is there were some unpleasant far right elements there. And I use the term far right. I'm not politically correct about that. You get these people who say, "Oh, the far right." Well, don't call us far right. If you're going to act like the far right, then I'm calling you far right. Okay. Um, some of them were even doing Nazi salutes. Okay. It's not an exaggeration. They were. Um, but what we're seeing, I think, comes down to a sort of cultural revolution. I was watching clips of Love Line Neighbour. I've kind of been watching it this year. I don't usually watch old sitcoms, but I don't know, I just got onto it. Stars Randolph Walker, Jack Smethurst as two neighbors, basically, who Nina Baden-Semper and I forget the lady who plays the other wife, but basically it's about a pretty racist white guy, Labour working class. It's set in London, not sure where exactly, and his, Trinidadian conservative neighbor moves in, and basically the sitcom is about their constant bickering. Now, the program absolutely doesn't censor the racism. In fact, if anything, it's a little bit repetitive. But it is also funny. The episodes are quite witty, and the jokes are almost always on the white racist. And yet, you get the impression, despite their constant insults to each other, and it works both ways. The black guy uses racial terms as well. Um, Despite their constant bickering, you get the impression that deep down they actually quite like each other. And a lot of it's, but anyway, those who know the series will know what I'm talking about. The idea of that airing today would be unconscionable. And yet, you look at the actors who were in that. Randolph Walker, one of our most prominent black actors. He spent many years on EastEnders. He said in this interview that the sort of outrage and the political correctness around it is ridiculous. It reminds me about because the show itself was not racist; it was mocking racist attitudes. That's the point. At a time when there were real concerns about mass immigration from the West Indies, um, I really think that what we're seeing now is this attempt to sort of basically purge all formats, all programs, and it isn't even black white issues. It's pretty much anything that can be deemed to be offensive. So faulty towers is in the firing line. Anti Deck, their Saturday night takeaway had to be thrown out because they want to use blackface. Um, it's getting to the point where everything is sort of in the target list of these purists. It's interesting though because stand-up comedians, the likes of Roy Chubby Brown and so on, are far, far more outrageous than some of the sitcoms that are actually being targeted. So it's interesting that there isn't the same sort of outrage against them. Maybe it's because they're not on mainstream TV. I don't know. But, UK TV and other streaming services are now just pulling entire episodes, like the Faulty Towers, Germans episode, things like that. Even though if you look at 1970s British sitcoms, they were actually usually written by left-wing writers and the humor was directed at racists. The joke was always on the white bigots. That's the irony about it. But it makes me think of what's now happening on our university campuses. The University of Sheffield, one of the most pathetic examples. They recently, in response to charges that there was racism in its corridors, adopted a program where they would pay students to go around monitoring fellow students for microaggressions. Now, they've justified this on the grounds that there were complaints of racial abuse. My response to that is if you have a student who feels that they have been racially bullied, they've been given a hard time, it needs to be taken seriously. I am not someone who trivializes bullying in any shape or form. I do think it needs to be taken seriously. What concerns me, though, is the approach the University of Sheffield has taken. Isn't like we will deal with bullies. There's no place for racial abuse. They're going way beyond that. They are looking for microaggressions. And they're actually saying that if you, as a matter of conversation, say, "Where are you from?" that's deemed a microaggression. If you say that to a black student as a way of making conversation, that's racist, supposedly, or at least it's a microaggression. The whole concept of microaggression is, in my opinion, bullshit. It is absolutely petty totalitarian nonsense. To those people who are of a very sensitive nature and who feel that they are being, I'm not going to just say, oh, they're being overly sensitive. Let me try and understand their thinking here, right? Sometimes you do get people who are stubborn and they don't listen to others, and I can understand, for example, if you are, let's say you're British Chinese, and someone says, they keep talking to you like you're from China. I can understand that would be annoying. If you are black and someone says, but where are you really from? I can understand that would be annoying. But the sort of things that the University of Sheffield were highlighting as part of their target, I think was definitely going down the wrong direction. It basically amounted to thought control. Very different from punishing racist behaviour. I'm not going to say there isn't racism in British universities, but I honestly think that we have seen a very petty, controlling left-wing intolerance in university campuses, where students are being absolutely shamed for no other reason than not going with the group think on this. I mean, the sort of bullying that J.K. Rowling is going through right now from militant trans activists, you can be absolutely sure that sort of thing will be happening in university campuses. And it is interesting to see what the priorities are. Hong Kong students last year suffered real bullying, like really serious abuse from mainland Chinese students. Not a single Chinese student was expelled, not one, despite abundant evidence for what was happening. So why? Is it because they're prioritizing Chinese investment? Most likely. So I do question where universities put their priorities with this. I came across an article in the Indie the other day, the Independent, and actually it would have been the I rarely get the Independent, but the writer was just talking about microaggressions and how everyday racism it's often subtle and it's often in the shadows and it's often not deliberate. So what she was saying is racism isn't some hardcore white skinhead yelling abuse at an Asian family. She's saying it's often very subconscious. I have a big problem with this way of thinking because when you start trying to really, really nitpick and look beneath the surface and try to really find hidden racism in everything, that to me is going to lead to basically, even if you say you're not supporting legislation, what it does is polarize people because white people who are not racists are going to think, okay, well, I'm not walking on eggshells here. I do think some people are stubborn. I mean, being from Northern Ireland, I have often had people say, talk to me as if I am a student that's come over from Ireland. And it's pretty frustrating when I've lived here for 20 years. I'm 34, so I've lived well over half my life in England. I've still got the accent, obviously, but I don't mind people asking questions. But what really bugs me, and I've mentioned this before, is when they say things like, um, "Oh, I was in Ireland once," and I'm thinking, "Well, good for you, so was I." And it's not that they're being racist; it's just they're being stubborn. So I honestly think a lot of what is deemed racism isn't racism; it's just ignorance and stubbornness. The problem with deeming everything racism is it devalues actual racism. Now, if people are being rude, if people are being stubborn, that is their problem and it's disrespectful. If I tell someone I've lived in England for 20 years, I expect them to listen to that and not keep, coming out with the same ridiculous questions. But I don't mind, when you meet someone for the first time, asking questions is a totally normal part of conversation. And if you're going to get really cagey, if someone has asked where you're from and you assume it's some sort of racial thing, you need to get over yourself. You need to really, how are you going to deal with life if that is how you respond to people? That is why I really, really have some concern about this whole woke culture of trying to find microaggressions in everything. So the whole concept of safe spaces in universities, the idea that we just cannot bear what the other person's opinion is. So we're going to, just block them out. We're going to cancel them to use the American vernacular. Um, I think it's different in cases of clear evidence of bullying. So, for example, if you have a group of Hong Kong students who want to discuss issues in Hong Kong, and they have been subjected to bullying from mainland Chinese students, and they are wary of being at a sort of public debate where maybe they'll get abuse from the Chinese students. It's understandable, but I am more of the opinion that basically, if you're going to have strong views on something, you need to argue it out, or just you don't even have to get into a confrontation. Confrontation. You don't even have to debate people. But what you shouldn't do is demand that they sort of want to be in a bubble. The world is a hard place, and I do worry that many of these younger millennials, not so much millennials of my age, but some younger millennials led by this insufferably intolerant woke culture, and it is incredibly intolerant. Um, in their zeal for changing the world, they go way too far because they're not really standing up for human rights and Western values and human liberty. What they are really doing is behaving like mini totalitarians, trying to constantly police people's way of thinking. Um, And it concerns me, particularly when there is a potential for legislation. And I've realized I've spoken for 20 minutes. Right, I'll leave it there. I do not like political correctness. I think it's fundamentally controlling in nature. But that doesn't mean that I think people should just be obnoxious or rude for the sake of it or deliberately provocative. Some people are stubborn, some people are ignorant, and some people are bigots. There's no question about it. But I am equally concerned about these mini totalitarians who are so fragile that they are constantly looking for reasons to be offended. And by the way, that's one of the things that can land you into hot water in the University of Sheffield. If you actually say, stop looking for reasons to be offended, that in itself is a microaggression. I really do feel concerned about what's happening in our university campuses. And it just reminds me of why I absolutely don't miss my uni days. I mean, that was in the mid 2000s, but I think it's got worse. So basically, all of us who have good values, who are genuinely anti-racist, and who are tired of these culture wars, we really just need to be assertive as to what's going on here. And the response to the woke culture microaggression isn't by endorsing far right types. It isn't by endorsing that sort of narrative either, because they are pushing out a narrative that is just as toxic and just as divisive, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll round it up there. Thanks for watching.